Witch, soothsayer, proven prophetess, and daughter of the devil. She's been called all of them. But who is the real Mother Shipton, aka Ursula Shipton? Did this Englishwoman, who supposedly had magical powers and who even Henry VIII was apparently aware of, actually exist, or is her story nothing but a legend? Stay tuned to hear the predictions she is credited with making, including the ones which appear to have come true, and how a pool near her reputed birthplace can seemingly turn objects to stone. The original story of Mother Shipton derives from a pamphlet published in 1641 by Richard Lowndes of London. It gives very little biographical information about her, we don't even get her first name, but it does make clear that she lived in England during the reign of Henry VIII and close to the northern city of York. It begins with the story that in 1530, when she heard that Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was coming to York, she predicted that he would never come there with the king. When Wolsey heard this, he was enraged and sent the Duke of Suffolk, Lord Percy, and Lord Darcy to interrogate her. They met up with a Master Beslet and went to her house to speak with her. When they arrived, they were shocked to find that she already knew them all by name, though they had never met her before, and she invited them in and gave them cakes and ale by the fireside while they talked to her. They asked her about her prophecy, and she said that Wolsey might see York but never come at it. When Suffolk said she would be burned for speaking thus after the cardinal did come to the city, she performed some magic in front of them, demonstrating how her handkerchief and staff would not burn in the fire, and said that this showed that she would be fine. She then made some predictions about her visitors' futures, telling Suffolk that the time will come you will be as low as I am, and that's a low one indeed. The Duke of Suffolk in 1530 was Charles Brandon, brother-in-law to the king, and I can't see what this prophecy would have referred to. He died in 1545, still in Henry's good graces, which was quite a feat, by the way. I actually wondered if the writer of this pamphlet confused him with his son-in-law, Henry Grey, also eventually the Duke of Suffolk and father of Lady Jane, because he was executed during the reign of Mary I, and that entailed falling very low. To Percy, she supposedly said that he would be buried in York pavement, but that his head would be stolen from the bar and carried into France. Percy, who is best remembered today as Anne Boleyn's one-time paramour, died in 1537 and was buried in Middlesex. I didn't find any suggestion that his head ever went to France, though. As for Darcy, he would, quote, "Have made a great gun, shoot it off, for it will do you no good. You are going to war. You will pain many a man, but you will kill none." The real Thomas Darcy, Baron Darcy of Templehurst, ended up on the wrong side of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537 and was executed on Tower Hill for his troubles. I suppose the pilgrimage could be seen as a kind of war, but I feel like I'm reaching here. After this, the men left, and lo and behold, when Wolsey got to Yorkshire, he only made it as far as Cawood Castle, from where he could see the city of York in the distance, before he was arrested and began a journey back to London, during which he died at Leicester. Thus, Mother Shipton's prophecy about him had come true. This having happened, the pamphlet says that Mother Shipton, who is referred to as Shipton's wife, indicating that she was married, spoke some more to Master Besley and made a string of prophecies to him. Conveniently, and as with all such prophecies in my experience, the wording and/or timing of these supposedly upcoming events is so vague as to be virtually meaningless, and I'm not going to read them all out to you as they are often quite incoherent. Some of them, however, included the coming of the King and Queen of Scotland so that king could take over England. That would be a reference to James VI becoming James I as well in 1603, a great war between Scotland and England, and the destruction of London. This last would later be seen as a reference to the Great Fire of London of 1666 by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, for according to diarist Samuel Pepys, when Rupert was sailing up the Thames into the remains of a largely ruined part of the city, he said that, "Now Shipton's prophecy is out." I would say, though, that London hadn't actually been destroyed, and also that you could just as easily argue, if you're into that sort of thing, that this so-called prophecy referred to the Blitz during World War II. That's what I mean about these prophecies in inverted commas being vague. The pamphlet is pretty short, at only 7 pages of text, so I'll leave it linked below for you if you want to read the list of predictions yourself. Before I explain the problems with this source and look at the others which discuss Mother Shipton, if you're enjoying my content, please remember to give the video a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on, as this really helps it with the YouTube algorithm overlords. You can also become a YouTube member for extra perks, or join me over on Patreon, where I provide early access to ad-free videos, bonus podcasts, and much more. I'll leave that linked below for you, along with links to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads if you join my free mailing list, and my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available on Amazon. Now, the number one issue with this pamphlet is that its contents are ridiculous, and we can immediately discount a huge chunk of it, namely the supernatural elements. The second problem is that it was only published in 1641, many decades after Mother Shipton would have had to have died, and over a century after her supposed meeting with the Duke of Suffolk, etc. It also gives no earlier sources to support its contents, even the more believable aspects of them. As such, it's not much better than a fairy tale, and the few quite specific predictions it listed, such as Wolsey not making it to York and James I's succession, were all ancient well-established history by 1641. However, there is one piece of contemporary evidence which does offer some limited support for the idea that Mother Shipton was a real figure, and it comes from no less a person than Henry VIII. In February 1537, he wrote a letter to the Duke of Norfolk in the midst of the Pilgrimage of Grace, in which he made the following comment: "You shall send up to us the traders Bigod, the friar of Knaresborough, Lech, if he may be taken, the vicar of Penrith and Townley, late chancellor to the Bishop of Carlisle, who has been a great promoter of these rebellions, the Witch of York, and one Dr. Pickering, a canon Birdlington." Now, this is very vague. It doesn't name Mother Shipton, but it does at least give a location and the fact that the king was talking about a woman who was evidently well known for supposedly being a witch. Perhaps this is the origin story of the later tales about Mother Shipton. There is also an interesting little coda to this part of the story, which is that the words "the Witch of York" were actually erased in the original document. Does this indicate that a mistake had been made, that no such person had existed, or just that it had been decided not to bring her to the king? It might just be the latter, as I think that had she been brought to him, we would have a better paper trail for her life in contemporary documents. So as of 1641, there were stories of a supposed witch with the power of prophecy and some type of pyromancy skills living near York 111 years earlier and going by the name Mother Shipton. She was apparently an adult married woman who had made a clutch of predictions, some of which seem to have come true by the reign of Charles I. There are no definitive sources supporting her existence before that, however, and the 1537 letter from Henry VIII to the Duke of Norfolk offers only the barest hint that she was real and could easily refer to someone else. At this point, nothing else was known of her, yet if you run a Google search on her name today, you'll find a much more detailed supposed biography. So where does that information come from? The answer is that the 1641 pamphlet was just the beginning of a series of publications which purported to tell her story. In 1642 came another, printed for G. Smith in London and called "Two Strange Prophecies, predicting wonderful events, to betide this year of danger in this climate, whereof some have already come to pass." These prophecies were given in 2 parts, with the first being a 22-line rhyming verse. It provides some very clear predictions regarding the Spanish Armada of 1588, the death of Queen Elizabeth and succession of James I in 1603, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, the death of the king's son Henry, who should have been Henry IX, the accession of Charles I in 1625, and the burgeoning civil wars in England in the 1630s. Unfortunately, all of this had already occurred by 1642, and this information is as much a prophecy as me telling you that there's going to be a global pandemic in 2020 as though that's new news. It's almost as though this was all made up in 1642 by someone who couldn't actually see the future. Imagine that. The second prophecy our anonymous author attributes to Mother Shipton just copies the 1641 pamphlet and so retells the story about Cardinal Wolsey not making it to York. Soon Mother Shipton had become a popular literary figure whose prophecies were appearing in all sorts of prints. For instance, in 1645, author William Lilly included an account of her supposed predictions in his book, a collection of ancient and modern prophecies concerning these present times. This material was copied from the earlier two works already discussed though, and gives us no new information, nor does a 1651 rendition of her prophecies. The next source of particular importance to this story is a play written by Thomas Thompson entitled The Life of Mother Shipton, a New Comedy. We don't know exactly when this was published because although the cover page says 1610, it has been postulated that this is a typo and that it was actually written between 1660 and circa 1670. In fact, someone at some point in history has even scrawled on the bottom of the copy I looked at that the date is wrong. One plotline in this production tells the story of a teenaged orphan called Agnes Shipton, daughter of Solomon Shipton, a ditch digger. One day, Agatha was sitting by a river near Knaresborough in Yorkshire, bemoaning her lot in life and resenting having to take alms from the local church when the devil, in disguise of course, overheard her and decided to take advantage of her desperate state and seduce her. He approached her, sweet-talked her, said he would be back the following day, and when he returned with two other devils in disguise, said he was going to marry her and the others were the witnesses. They went to the devil's house where they sat down to a banquet with a room full of people, with Agatha starting to enjoy herself, queening it over all the attendants. She was married to the devil, who immediately confessed his true nature to her, and Agatha decided to stay with him. She then awakes in the next scene of the play, back in her cottage, with her looks ruined. The devil visits her though, chasing away neighbours who are annoying her, and tells her that as his wife, she must undertake all manner of unpleasant activities, including murder, witchcraft, and prophecies. She is later visited for her prophesying power by the Abbot of Beverley, which is in Yorkshire, who is worried about the fall of the abbeys. There were later attempts to have her arrested as a witch, but near the end of the play, Agatha repents and wants to turn away from her devil husband in order to avoid hell. She and her maid, who the devil tries to seduce in her place, meet with an angel, who tells her that she can be saved through the Bible. Nowhere in the play does she have a daughter, and she herself is Mother Shipton. Now keep that storyline in your mind as I tell you about a pamphlet authored by Irish writer Richard Head, of which the earliest surviving edition is from 1677, but the title of which suggests that it was originally published a decade earlier. It contains most of the details you'll hear given about Mother Shipton today, and was entitled The Life and Death of Mother Shipton, being not only a true account of her strange birth and most important passages of her life, but also all her prophecies, now newly collected and historically experienced from the time of her birth in the reign of King Henry VII until this present year, 1667. Head claimed that the information he was providing came from writings belonging to an old monastery in Yorkshire, and that he had come by them because some unnamed gentleman whose ancestors had been given this monastery by Henry VIII had kept them, and they were fortunately still legible and had been copied out by an impartial hand. It's all suitably vague. We don't find out the name of the monastery, or the writer of the original documents, or the gentleman who supposedly showed them to Head, and the reason is, of course, that Head made the whole thing up, a conclusion I think you'll agree with when you hear what he had to say. Head claimed that according to these documents, in 1486, a 15-year-old orphan girl named Agnes Shipton was living in Knaresborough, Yorkshire, near a local landmark called the Dropping Well. She had nothing to her name and was living off the charity of the parish, which she resented so much that she was by that point starving. One day, whilst sitting under a tree next to a river, the devil came to her in the guise of a handsome young man, offering to make all her problems go away. He said he would meet with her the following day, which he did with a whole host of attendants, and took Agatha away to a fine house with lots of servants and beautiful clothes, where he married and slept with her and promised her the earth, before unceremoniously dumping her back in reality with the fine house and clothing all gone. 2 or 3 days had passed, and the neighbours were shocked to see the change in her in such a short space of time, because this young, quote, plump and fresh girl now looked worn out. She wouldn't take their alms, though, insisting that the aspen leaves she had in her pocket were money, and the devil continued to visit her in her home, because she now had a cottage, even though at the start of Head's tale she didn't. Agatha began to act very erratically and withdrew from the company of other people, while strange things began to happen to the local villagers who bothered her with their visits and questions. She quickly gained the reputation of a witch and was soon after apprehended by 2 men and brought before the local justice, from whom she escaped by summoning up a dragon to carry her away. Maybe we should just call her Daenerys. Now, apart from the dragon, I trust you can see that this version of events matches up with the Thomas Thompson play extremely closely, and it appears that one has plagiarised the other. But thanks to the fact that we don't know for sure which came out first, we can't be sure which is the original, and in the course of researching this topic, I have seen claims for both sides of that argument. Whatever the answer, from this point on, Head's story begins to diverge from that of Thompson and gives an entirely different fate to Agatha. No one dared to go near her for a while after her dragon antics, until it became clear that she was pregnant, at which point she was brought before the justice again and said the father was not mortal. She was released and gave birth to her daughter, who, unlike the earlier source I described to you, had the surname Shipton from birth rather than from a marriage. The child made horrible noises, and again, unlike versions of the Shipton story from the 1640s, which presented an ordinary-looking woman, her appearance was deeply alarming. Head says that she was of an indifferent height, but very morose and big-boned, her head very long, with great goggling but sharp and fiery eyes, her nose of an incredible and unproportionable length, having in it many crooks and turnings, adorned with many strange pimples of divers colours, as red, blue, and mixed, which like vapours of brimstone gave such a lustre to her affrighted spectators in the dead time of the night, that one of them confessed several times in my hearing that her nurse needed no other light to assist her in the performance of her duty. Her cheeks were of a black, swarthy complexion, much like a mixture of the black and yellow jaundice, wrinkled, shrivelled, and very hollow, insomuch that as the ribs of her body, so the impression of her teeth were easily to be discerned through both sides of her face, answering one side to the other like the notches in a valley, excepting only 2 of them which stood quite out of her mouth, in imitation of the lushes of a wild boar, or the tooth of an elephant, a thing so strange in an infant that no age can parallel. Her chin was of the same completion as her face, turning up towards her mouth, and shrieks being heard from an unknown cause, as if there had been a more than an ordinary correspondence between her teeth and it. Her neck so strangely distorted that her right shoulder was forced to be a supporter to her head, it being propped up by the help of her chin, in such sort that the right side of her body stood much lower than the left, like the reeling of a ship that sails with a side wind. Again, her left side was quite turned the contrary way, as if her body had been screwed together piece after piece, and not rightly placed, her left shoulder hanging just perpendicular to her fundament. Her legs very crooked and misshapen, the toes of her feet looking towards her left side, so that it was very hard for any person, could she have stood up, to guess which road she intended to steer her course, because she never could look that way she resolved to go. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is a classic description of a fairy tale witch, easily recognisable to us today because it's now so ubiquitous as a Halloween costume. Head continued on with his biography of Mother Shipton, saying that the child was put out to nurse because Agatha couldn't care for her. After about 6 months, the nurse came home one day, having left the child there unattended it seems, and found the house all opened up as though it had been broken into. When she and the neighbours ventured inside, they heard a horrible noise like screeching cats, and when the men tried to run out again, yokes appeared around their necks in the shape of a cross. Then an old naked woman appeared, who, if I'm reading it correctly because it's not very clearly written, hung upside down by her heels, toes, and even midriff for half an hour. The neighbourhood women seem to have become detached from the rest of the group and were eventually found further inside the house lying on their stomachs, their clothes all up around their heads, and here I quote, "2 great black cats were playing hocus pocus upon their posters, which the men in vain attempted to drive away, until at last their own stavery procured the women's freedom from that employment. As the group tried to leave the house again, they were forced to dance themselves almost to death, carrying on their shoulders, quote, an imp in the likeness of a monkey or ape." Eventually they escaped and went to tell the other villagers of their ordeal, who came back with them and, upon entering the house, heard the child making horrible noises. They found her in her cradle, which was floating 3 yards up inside the chimney, then just left her there with her nurse, as you would under such circumstances. This strange existence carried on, with the devil visiting his daughter every day in the shape of an animal, and the nurse further traumatized by strange noises, furniture which wandered about of its own accord, and food which disappeared before she could eat it. Finally, little Mother Shipton was old enough to go to school, and left her nurse to do so, being placed in the care of the parish. At school she proved to be unusually bright, able to read immediately, which astonished her teacher and caused the other jealous pupils to tease her, as did her physical deformities. She responded by using her magical powers to punish them and was removed from the school for doing so. She was becoming famous for her abilities and strange mutterings, however, and people were increasingly coming to her for predictions of the future. Head also mentions at this point that she was living in a house with some other young woman, referred to as the wench, though we have no explanation as to how she got a house. The tale of a maid living with her, though, does echo the Thompson play. The donations from the visitors were how she made her money, and there is a mention of the Cardinal Wolsey prediction, though in this instance it is not as detailed as in other sources, and essentially just says she predicted his downfall, it happened, and this made her more famous. The pamphlet continues with more convoluted predictions supposedly made by Mother Shipton, covering all major events in England up to the reign of Charles II, but I won't list them here in detail as there are too many. I've linked it below for you though if you want to read the entire thing. He finished with some vague prophecies supposedly about the future and said that Mother Shipton lived till she was of an extraordinary age, and though she was generally believed to be a witch, yet all persons whatsoever that either read or heard her prophecies have esteemed them little less than oraculous, and her memory to this day is much honoured by those of her own country. Now this publication is obviously a complete fabrication, and honestly, I wouldn't take seriously anything it says about Mother Shipton, including the non-fantastical elements like her date of birth and her mother's name. As I've already said, the early part of the story was potentially lifted from the Thompson play, with the major change being that Agatha was the mother of Mother Shipton rather than being that figure herself, and other sources indicate that the surname Shipton came from a marriage, not a teenage mother. Head's story does not even follow any kind of internal logic. It's ridiculous to think that in 16th century England, or even today, that if terrifying magical events were happening, the child in question would be left with her nurse, then sent to school with other children, then apparently given a house, viewed with wonder, and visited by all and sundry for predictions. Please, real people got burnt for witchcraft for far less than that. Richard Head was also known for writing what were clearly fictional stories and pretending they were real. He wrote about the mythical island of Hy-Brasil off the west coast of Ireland, for instance, which I already have an episode about that I'll leave linked for you. In none of the sources mentioned yet have we been given a first name for Mother Shipton, except the play which presented her as the teenaged Agatha. The name Ursula, by which Agatha's daughter is commonly known now, only appears in yet another pamphlet published in 1686 and called The Strange and Wonderful History of Mother Shipton, plainly setting forth her prodigious birth, life, death, and burial, with an exact collection of all her famous prophecies, more complete than ever yet before published, and large explanations showing how they have all along been fulfilled to this very year. In case you haven't noticed yet, people in the past liked having really long titles for their books. It was printed for someone identified only as W.H. and sold by J. Connors in London. Other than the name, it largely follows Head's 1667 or 1677 work. The author claims that she was born in Yorkshire, and though no one is really sure where, because several towns have pretended to the honour of her birth, Knaresborough near the dropping well is the most popular. Here too, her father was supposed to be magical in some way, either a necromancer, the phantasm of Apollo, or a demon, and her teenage mother was called either Agatha or Ematha. Again, we have the story of her meeting with the devil and conceiving her daughter, who was born on the 4th of July, 1488 in this version of events, after a terrible labour and just as a loud crack of thunder was heard. Here too, she was badly deformed. She was christened Ursula Southtell, a conveniently appropriate name for someone who was to be a soothsayer, which in this case was her mother's surname. The author, following the story from 1641, specifically says that Shipton was a later married name. When she was 2, her mother realised how evil she was because the child was communing with spirits, and so Agatha/Ematha went into a convent of the Order of St. Bridget near Nottingham to do penance for the rest of her life, while Ursula was given to a nurse. This echoes the story in the play that Agatha had rejected the devil and sought redemption. Once again, we get the horror story of that nurse coming home to find the house all opened up, and the trauma she and the neighbours went through when they entered it, and the discovery of Ursula up the chimney in the floating cradle. There are also stories of Ursula punishing those who were mean to her because of her appearance. This author provides much more biographical information regarding her marriage, however, saying that she was suspected of using charms or love powder to entrap a carpenter called Thomas Shipton, who she married when she was 24 and lived comfortably with, though they never had children. She also gained a reputation for being able to see the future, and of course it wouldn't be a Mother Shipton story if we didn't have a version of the Cardinal Wolsey prediction, which this author copies from Richard Lowndes' 1641 pamphlet. He or she then lists a number of other prophecies which are also lifted from that earlier work and from Head's pamphlet. So what we have here is mostly a hodgepodge of earlier writers' work with a few extra details thrown in. No contemporary sources are cited, and there's no reason to trust anything in this pamphlet any more than the information given in the previous works I've looked at for you. We're still in fairy tale land, and what we're seeing here is the development of a literary character over time, a little bit like how the stories around Santa Claus have developed, with the gradual addition of details like his reindeer, his workshop at the North Pole, and even his red and white outfit. The writer does finish, though, by giving us a little epitaph for Mother Shipton, saying, "The famous prophetess continued several years esteemed, as the sibyl or oracle of these times. At last, being 63 years of age, meaning 73 and putting us in the year 1561, she found the time in the Black Book of Destiny approaching wherein she must give a final adieu to the world, which she foretold to a day to divers people, and at the hour predicted, having taken solemn leave of her friends, laid herself down on her bed and died, on whom poet of this age bestowed this epitaph. Here lies she who never lied, whose skill so often has been tried. Her prophecies shall still survive, and ever keep her name alive." Over the following decades, and eventually centuries, more and more stories about Ursula appeared, and they generally blended together information given in the previous publications already mentioned, even just straight up copying them on many occasions, so I'm not going to give a detailed breakdown of them here. There were some variations, though. For instance, in a 1715 pamphlet, Agatha died in childbirth, and it was her ghost that was the naked woman hanging by her heels, toes, or midriff in the nurse's house in front of the terrified neighbours. The supposed prophecies that Mother Shipton made are also updated to cover the reigns of William and Mary and Queen Anne, which hadn't happened yet when the other pamphlets were published. Later on, in 19th century books about her, there are clear references in her supposed prophecies to things like telegrams and steel ships, though I've seen bloggers nowadays say that references to ideas flying through the air are an accurate prediction of the coming of the internet. No, gang, Ideas were flying through the air, so to speak, long before that, including in the 1800s. Her surname also changed from Southtell to Southill and other variants. One of the most notable changes to her story concerns the place of her birth. Nowadays, there is a tourist attraction in Knaresborough, Yorkshire, which is called Mother Shipton's Cave, and which claims that she was born in it. Those who run it also say that this is the oldest tourist attraction in England because it has been on the go since 1630. This isn't true. People have been paying to get into Westminster Abbey, for instance, and get guided tours to see the famous tombs for longer than that. And given that there's no written evidence of the Mother Shipton legend prior to the 1640s, and even then it doesn't say that she was born in a cave, there's no way this cave has been claiming a connection to her for that long. It seems like, at best, this was a local attraction which later adapted to claim a connection to a famous local legend once the story of Mother Shipton took off. And why not? After all, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland wasn't actually made by giants either, but it's a good story for the tourists. Something that might have encouraged this fiend connection between the cave and Ursula is the petrifying well which is close to it, because remember, Mother Shipton was supposedly born near a place called the Dropping Well, which might well be one and the same. This well, which is actually a pool with a kind of mini waterfall, is remarkable because the water is so full of minerals that items which are left in it for long enough get coated in these materials and appear to turn to stone. 400 years ago, this would certainly have seemed magical. So let's sum this story up. Prior to the 1640s, there's no evidence that Mother Shipton ever existed, despite the fact that 1641 would be 80 years after the death date given for her in some of the earlier pamphlets. Her representation in these pamphlets changes quite drastically between the 1640s and the 1660s too, taking her from your average-looking housewife in Yorkshire, who made some predictions about Cardinal Wolsey, the Duke of Suffolk, and his associates, to a haggard, utterly deformed monster whose father was the devil, who was exhibiting extreme supernatural powers from her infancy, and who made a huge number of highly accurate predictions, yet managed to leave no trace in contemporary records. She also conveniently never made any clear prediction about anything that was going to happen after the time her predictions were published, and despite being a clear example of a witch in the 15th and 16th centuries, she wasn't burnt or otherwise executed, and her antics were even viewed as comedic, even benevolent at times, and she was respected for her magical abilities, none of which rings true for the time period. The mention made of a Yorkshire witch by Henry VIII in 1537 is too vague to really attribute to her, but it might just be the genesis of the story, which otherwise appears fully formed in the reign of Charles I. What's my feeling about this woman? I think she probably never existed, or if there was a real woman in the Tudor period who was the inspiration for this myth, she bore little to no resemblance to the stories which appeared over a century later. The so-called evidence that you will see cited as proof of her life is in fact no better than a fairy tale, which wouldn't be out of place in the collections of the Grimm brothers or Hans Christian Andersen, and many of the details might have originated in a comedic play or in the mind of known Irish fiction writer Richard Head. The details also change from source to source as different writers opted to invent new and sometimes conflicting reports of her life. It's a fun little story though, and a good example of how myths and legends are born and built. If I ever find myself in Knaresborough, I can think of worse things to do than to stop by Mother Shipton's cave and the petrifying well, and maybe even admire the statue of her in the town. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments if you think Mother Shipton was a real historical figure at any point, and for another story of an incredible early modern woman who defies the laws of reality, see my episode all about the 140-year-old Countess of Desmond. I hope you enjoy it, and until next time, keep learning.